All right, so we had another very interesting week in the markets. We had a pretty bad week in the stock markets. Bitcoin, not so much. First things first, if you get value out of this video, please like and subscribe. I really appreciate that. So first things first here, I got to talk about Bitcoin because Bitcoin made another all-time high this week after hitting a new all-time high the previous week as well. And I think that we're just getting started. MicroStrategy is buying more. And this is another thing that I think it's hardly talked about literally at all outside of the Bitcoin community is the insane rise of MicroStrategy. I mean, MicroStrategy is literally the best performing stock in the markets this year. I believe it's up like over 200, 300%. I don't even know what it is off the top of my head. And they just keep rolling ahead. And I put out a tweet earlier this week that over the next decade, I think MicroStrategy is going to be a top 10 company in the world. And honestly, I think that it could be the biggest company in the world. Like, I think that is a legitimate prospect over the next 10 or 20 years, that MicroStrategy is the number one company in the world. And why do I say that? Well, if you look at that right now, MicroStrategy trades at about a 2.5 times premium to the amount of Bitcoin they hold. And if Bitcoin goes to $1 million, well, that implies that they're over a $2 trillion company. So I don't think that people quite grasp just how good of an opportunity MicroStrategy is and just how crazy genius their investment strategy is. Now, you have to keep in mind that for their investment strategy to work, Bitcoin does have to go up over time, which I think is going to happen, which is why I'm so intrigued by them. So next halving cycle, next downturn in the markets, I do plan on buying some MicroStrategy. I don't own anything right now. I have owned a little bit in the past, but this is in a taxable account. If you want exposure to Bitcoin, the ETFs are not the way to go, in my opinion. It's MicroStrategy. Number one, because you don't have to pay the fees, and number two, because you're going to get leverage returns. Now, you're probably going to get leverage returns on the downside as well. That's why you have to be careful about when you buy. But if you're planning on holding over the long run, you don't really care about that. So next time we get a downturn in the markets, I would say probably 2026. I think 2025 is going to be a massively bullish year. And then probably 2026, we see a bit of a pullback. A more major pullback, and then going into 2027, and then 2028 we have the next halving. So that's what I think. But when it comes to Bitcoin in general, that's the main thing I wanted to get at here, is Bitcoin obviously making a new record high. Something that is not being talked about enough is Bitcoin's up about 40% roughly in the last month. The stock market, the S&P 500 is up, 35% this in the last year. If you look at gold is up about the same. And it just boggles my mind that a lot of these gold people are, oh my God, people are sleeping on gold. Look at how good gold is doing. Gold. And it's like, Bitcoin's up more than gold is in the last month compared to gold in the last year. And gold has had, over the last decade, I'm pretty sure it's had one of its best, if not its best years. And I'm not necessarily bearish on gold. What I'm pointing out is that Bitcoin is clearly better, clearly better. And the one of the main reasons I'm so bullish on Bitcoin is that the vast majority of people, even in the finance industry, are still sleeping on Bitcoin. I've said time and time again, I don't think the majority of people ever wake up. But I think that it's realistic that 20 or 30% of the population wakes up. And right now, we're still at 1 or 2. So we still have a long ways to go. I think that Bitcoin is a sleeping giant where we stand right now. I think that 100,000 by the end of the year is more than likely. And I think that next year, we're looking at probably 200, maybe 300,000. And another important point that I seen recently is the the boom bust cycles for Bitcoin. They very well may be a thing of the past. I'm not necessarily entirely convinced of that. But when you have the ETFs, when you have institutional investors slowly starting to pick up, eventually I think we're going to get to the point to where I think that the boom bust cycles definitely go away. I think it's mostly boom, but maybe a little bit of bust. I think we're just going to, the volatility will come down. But I think that the bullishness on the upside I think is still going to be there. But the downside probably won't be there as much, because eventually it's going to get to the point to where it's like, who wants to sell? Like, seriously, who wants to sell? When you know that these things are worth millions of dollars, why would you sell? So I think that that's something that's overwhelmingly likely here. So Bitcoin, and I was saying for the entirety of that lull from like May or April or May up until like a couple of weeks ago, I was saying all the time, it's only a matter of time until we have a massive run up. And I think that that just happened, but I still think we're at the early stages of it. The next important or interesting thing I wanted to talk about here was the top inflows and outflows when it comes to ETFs. And Jim Bianco summarizes it pretty clearly here. 4 of the top 10 are S&P 500. Two of the largest are large bond funds. The only alternative is the Bitcoin fund. And something important to point out here is IBIT, the iShares Bitcoin ETF, has had the fourth most, actually the third most inflows this year. And it's the best performing ETF on the list. And you also have to keep in mind that just because there's massive inflows doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get crazy good returns. I mean, the bond funds have done basically nothing. And just because you've had outflows doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get bad returns. In fact, if you look at the ones that have had outflows, none of them are negative. In fact, GBDC is the number one. I mean, that's understandable. But you look at like the Ultra Pro QQQ, that one's up 60%. This iShares one's up 20%. So this doesn't necessarily prove a massive trend one way or the other, but I think that the institutional money is just starting to pour into Bitcoin, and that is where the real money is, and that's where the real money is going to come from. So keep an eye out for that. But I don't think we can stress just enough. I mean, the NASDAQ, the biggest NASDAQ ETF has had less inflows this year than Bitcoin has. And we are still at the point to where the vast majority of people in the finance industry will not touch Bitcoin. That is going to change over time. So I think that we, within the next 5 to 10 years, I mean, we could see years where $100-200 billion pours into these Bitcoin ETFs. Like hundreds of billions of dollars will pour in individual years. And that's not even including a lot of people that aren't buying the ETFs. I mean, that's not including just regular old exchange buying. So I think that we are still in the very early stages. I think second or third inning is still where we're at. The only point to why I would even consider being bearish is till we're in the millions of dollars. That's not going to happen this cycle. It's unlikely, but I think probably next cycle, maybe the one after that. But I am still massively bullish, and I don't see any reason not to be, like literally any reason. As far as the markets go this week, like I mentioned earlier, it was a pretty rough week for the markets because the S&P was down about 2%, the NASDAQ was down about 3%, the Meg 7 was down about 3%. Mid caps were down about 1.5%, small caps were down about 2.5%. So the best area of the market was the mid caps. And the value side of the market wasn't down quite as much either. So a little bit of a rotation there. I think that a pullback was kind of expected given the massive run-up we had last week. I don't think that's anything out of the ordinary. Long story short there, my My thinking is still bullish because I don't see any reason to be bearish in the near term. In the medium to long term, yeah, I think we're overdue for a 10-20% pullback, but nobody knows when that's going to happen or even if it's going to happen. So as far as earnings go, we did have some earnings this week as well. Not as many, but still a decent amount. Home Depot, they beat earnings. They raised guidance. They were actually down a little bit on the week, although I think that's mostly due to the market as a whole just being down. SLVM, this is one that I have on a watch list. I've never bought. I'm not sure if I would buy, but on the watch list nonetheless. Beat earnings and revenue, so they actually were basically flat on the week. Occidental Petroleum, obviously being famous for being one of Warren Buffett's top stocks. They did beat earnings. They released pretty solid earnings, although they were down on the week. Although, again, the markets as a whole were down on the week, so that's not necessarily something that's completely out of the ordinary. Skyworks Solutions. This is one that's actually been hit pretty hard this year. It's actually down on the year. I have not sold any of my position. I'm still buying, although it's kind of hard to still have faith in this company. Although you have to keep in mind that typically semiconductor companies are cyclical, so I'm still cautiously optimistic, but it definitely is a little bit disappointing. But they did beat earnings and revenue, so for a company that's still beating earnings, they're still growing fairly well. I don't see why I would sell. Shopify, they released good earnings. They were up quite a bit after earnings. They came down a little bit, but they were up a lot on the week. Actually, how much were they up? Just out of curiosity, they were up 38% on the week, which is just crazy. They're a good company. I would buy them if they got cheap enough, but I think they're way too expensive where they're at right now. TTEK, this is one I have on a watch list as well. They beat earnings and revenue. However, they were down quite a bit on the week. I think they basically hit a new 52-week low, actually. No, not quite. But they still were down quite heavily on the week. Applied Materials was also down quite a bit on the week. They did beat earnings and revenue. They released somewhat questionable guidance, which is why I think they were down on the week. I still like this company. I'm buying them where they're at right now. I'm not concerned long-term, short-term maybe, but I'm not concerned long-term. And the last one here is Alibaba. Alibaba released questionable earnings. They were down quite a bit on the week. They beat earnings. They missed revenue. And I've said time and time again that I'm not touching Chinese stocks just because I think that there's too much risk there. And not to mention, too, their economy's in a lot of trouble. I mean, they have an obviously concerning demographic problem. They have a real estate problem. I don't see the appeal of China right now. I really don't. I mean, a lot of people have compared it to Japan in the 80s, and I think that's actually a half decent comparison. So obviously there's some differences, but I think that's a half decent comparison. So anyway, that's what I wanted to bring up this week. If you liked the video, like I mentioned, please like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff, and stay tuned for more.